The condensation on a glass of cheap Prosecco is a reliable metric for how much I want to be somewhere. On a scale of bone dry to a puddle on the tablecloth, I was currently at a full-blown flood. I stood by the buffet line, watching a single bead of water track its way down the flute, carving a path through the frost. It was my cousin Leo's engagement party, a mid-range banquet hall in Jersey with carpets that smelled like industrial lilac and 40 years of spilled gin. I'm an HVAC technician. I spend my days looking at the guts of buildings, the parts people try to hide behind drywall and dropped ceilings. I notice when a ventilation duct is rattling, and I notice when a room has the wrong kind of energy. Right then, the energy was vibrating at a frequency that made my teeth ache. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. You look like you're calculating the load-bearing capacity of the floor joists, Evan, my brother Marcus said, sliding up beside me. He looked uncomfortable in a suit that was clearly a size too small across the shoulders. Marcus was the youngest, a high school gym teacher who still believed most problems could be solved with a firm handshake and a whistle. Relax, it's a party. We're safe. They weren't invited. Safe is a strong word for a room filled with people who think passive-aggressive is a love language, I said, taking a sip of the sour wine. I scanned the crowd. Our middle brother, Julian, was across the room, already deep into a third scotch, looking like he wanted to punch the ice sculpture. Leo promised me they wouldn't be here. I asked him 3 times. I told him if Hale and Mara showed up, the 3 of us were walking out. Leo's a good kid. He knows the history, Marcus muttered, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. He started picking at a tray of stuffed mushrooms. Dad hasn't called in 6 months anyway. Why would he start now? He's too busy funding Mara's Save the Wetlands Gala or whatever she's calling her latest vanity project. I leaned back against a fake Roman pillar. I'm 36, and I've spent a decade being the difficult son because I have a memory like a digital ledger. I remember when the college fund my grandfather set up for us suddenly developed a leak. I remember the Christmas when my own children were given hand-me-down toys from a garage sale while Mara's nephews unwrapped brand-new tablets. I remember the way my father, Hale Trenwick, looked at his shoes every time his wife spoke over me. It wasn't about the money, though the money was significant. It was the erasure. It was the slow, methodical way we were being pruned from the family tree like unwanted branches. The air is wrong, I said. The air? Marcus frowned. The pressure. Look at Aunt Sarah. I nodded toward our father's sister. She was hovering near the double doors, checking her watch every 30 seconds and glancing at the head table. She wasn't acting like a woman at a celebration. She was acting like a lookout. She's waiting for a cue. You're being paranoid, Evan. It's the job. You spend too much time in dark basements. In dark basements, you learn to hear the pests before you see them, I replied. I adjusted my collar. I wasn't wearing a suit. I wore a crisp charcoal work shirt and dark slacks. I like to be ready to move. I like clothes that don't snag. My hands, calloused and mapped with small scars from sheet metal, felt heavy at my sides. I felt a strange, cold calm settling over me. It's the same feeling I get when I find a cracked heat exchanger in a furnace. The realization that something is fundamentally broken and dangerous. But because I've found it, I can now deal with it. The music, some generic Top 40 remix, seemed to dip in volume. The heavy oak doors at the back of the hole didn't just open, they were presented. Hale Trenwick walked in first. He was 61, still holding on to the broad-shouldered frame of the contractor he used to be before he traded his tool belt for a golf club and a trophy wife. He looked tan, healthy, and entirely too satisfied. Beside him, draped in a silk wrap that probably cost more than my work van, was Mara Solon. She was 52, with hair pulled back so tight it seemed to sharpen her features into a point. She didn't walk, she presided. The room didn't go silent, which was the first tell. Instead, a specific kind of choreographed noise started. A flurry of, "Oh, look who made it," and "what a surprise," that sounded like it had been rehearsed in a parking lot 20 minutes prior. "Those liars," Marcus whispered, his face flushing a deep, angry red. Leo lied to us. The whole family lied. Not just lied, I said, my voice dropping into a low, rhythmic register. They coordinated. This is a debut. I watched them move through the crowd. My father looked uncomfortable, catching glimpses of us and immediately veering toward the bar. But Mara was a heat-seeking missile. She headed straight for the center of the room, near where the engagement gifts were piled. She was carrying a leather portfolio under her arm, clutched like a holy relic. I didn't move. I didn't rush over to start a scene. I stood by my pillar and watched the mechanics of the betrayal. I saw the way our cousins and uncles drifted toward them, forming a protective circle that pointedly excluded the 3 Trenwick brothers. We were the outliers now, the ungrateful sons who had dared to stop calling, who had dared to ask where the trust distributions had gone. Julian joined us, his breath smelling of peat and frustration. We're leaving. Now. I'm not doing this. No, I said, my hand catching his arm. My grip was firm, the kind of pressure I used to seat a pipe. We aren't leaving. Evan, look at her, Julian hissed, pointing at Mara. She's glowing. She's won. They got the whole family to back them up on this ambush. If we stay, we're just props in her play. If we leave, we're the villains who walked out on Leo's big night, I said. If we stay, we see the hand she's playing. You never walk away from a machine until you know exactly why it's malfunctioning. Mara caught my eye across the room. She didn't flinch. She gave me a small, tight smile, the kind a predator gives a trapped meal. She whispered something to Hale, who gave a curt, pained nod, and then she began to move toward the microphone stand near the head table. She's going to make a speech, Marcus said, his voice trembling. She's going to do it right here. Let her, I said. I reached into my pocket and felt the cool glass screen of my phone. I had been preparing for a moment of friction for months, though I hadn't expected it to happen over lukewarm chicken piccata. I had files, I had dates, I had the original trust documents from before the adjustments began to surface. I had spent my nights after work cross-referencing ledger entries while my wife and kids slept, driven by a nagging itch in my brain that told me my father's sudden frugality wasn't just old age. Mara tapped the microphone. The screech of feedback echoed through the hall, a sharp, piercing sound that set everyone's nerves on edge. Excuse me, she said, her voice honeyed and artificial. If I could just have everyone's attention for a moment. I know we're here for Leo and Sarah, but Hale and I wanted to share something special, something that speaks to the future of this entire family. I saw our relatives leaning in. They weren't just listening, they were hungry. Mara had been feeding them a narrative for years, that we were the problem, that we were greedy, that we were the reason for the family's internal rot. She was about to provide the proof. We've spent a lot of time thinking about legacy, Mara continued, her gaze sliding over to me, lingering just a second too long. And about who truly deserves to carry the Trenwick name forward. There have been misunderstandings, disloyalties. But today, we're setting the record straight. She patted the leather portfolio. I looked at my father. He was staring at a point on the wall about 6 inches above my head. He looked like a man who had sold his soul for a quiet life and was only just realizing the interest rates were higher than he'd anticipated. He was a contractor, he knew about foundations. He had to know his was built on sand. This is it, Julian muttered, stepping forward. I'm going to stop her. Stay put, I commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. Julian bristled, but stayed. I watched Mara open the portfolio. She began to pull out papers, glossy, high-quality copies of what looked like the trust amendments we'd heard rumors about but never seen. She held them up like she was presenting evidence in a court of law, her smile widening into something jagged and triumphant. I want everyone to see the truth of how we're protecting our future, she said. I didn't feel angry. That was the strange part. As I watched her prepare to publicly dismantle our standing in the family, to justify the theft of our children's futures, I felt a profound sense of clarity. It was like looking at a complex wiring diagram and finally seeing the short circuit. She thought she was the one holding the power because she had the documents and the audience. She didn't realize that I was the one who knew how the building was heated, how the doors locked, and exactly where the structural weaknesses were hidden. She was playing a social game. I was playing a mechanical one. I took a final sip of the Prosecco. It was warm now, and the glass was dripping. I set it down on the table with a soft, deliberate click. All right, I whispered to myself. Let's see what's behind the wall. Mara cleared her throat, her eyes locked onto mine, ready to deliver the first blow. The room was silent, the air heavy and stagnant, waiting for the spark. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I just waited for her to start the fire so I could decide exactly how it was going to burn. Mara didn't just speak, she projected. She had that specific nonprofit gala voice, trained, melodic, and layered with a false sincerity that felt like a coat of cheap varnish over rotting wood. She held the papers up, the overhead chandeliers catching the glare of the plastic protectors. Family is a privilege, not a birthright, she said, her voice amplified by the speakers vibrating through the lilac-scented air. Hale and I have spent the last year auditing the family trust. It hasn't been easy. We've discovered that certain expectations of entitlement have led to, let's call them discrepancies. To ensure the Trenwick legacy remains secure, we've had to make some very difficult, very permanent adjustments. She began to pass out the packets. It was a coordinated strike. 2 of her cousins, men who had always looked at my father's success with a mixture of hunger and resentment, stepped forward to help distribute the folders to the various tables. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the room, a dry, papery locust swarm. Julian snatched a folder from a passing cousin, his knuckles white. I didn't need to look at it. I already knew the architecture of the lie. I could see it in the way the font was slightly mismatched on the signature page, a tiny serration in the logic of the document. "She's cut us out," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "Evan, she's actually done it. She's moved the entire secondary tier of the trust into a private foundation she controls. It says here we've been liquidated due to unfulfilled familial obligations." The room began to murmur. It was a sickening sound, the sound of 40 people deciding which way the wind was blowing and turning their sails accordingly. Our relatives started looking at us, not with sympathy, but with the cold, hard eyes of people who had just been told we were no longer part of the winning team. Aunt Sarah looked away when I caught her eye. Uncle Barry actually shifted his chair a few inches further from our table. "You have something to say, Evan?" Mara asked. She was still at the microphone, her head tilted at a condescending angle. "You've always been the observant one, the one who thinks he knows how everything works." I felt Marcus start to move, his chest heaving, ready to shout, ready to make the scene she wanted. I put a hand on his shoulder, a heavy, grounding weight. I stepped forward, not toward the microphone, but toward the center of the floor. My boots made a solid, rhythmic sound on the hardwood border of the carpet. I felt very steady. When you're working on a rooftop in a high wind, you learn to find your center of gravity. "I do know how things work, Mara," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but I've spent years talking over the hum of industrial blowers. I know how to make a word carry. I know that a system only functions when the valves are open. You've spent a lot of time trying to close them. "We're protecting your father, Evan," she said, her smile tightening. "He's worked his whole life for this. He shouldn't have to watch it be drained by ungrateful children who haven't checked on him in months." I looked at my father. He was holding a glass of scotch now, staring into the amber liquid as if it contained a map of a life he actually enjoyed. He looked small. The man who taught me how to sweat a copper pipe looked like he was made of cardboard. "Is that right, Hale?" I asked. "Are you being protected?" He didn't look up. "Mara's handled the paperwork, Evan. She's looking out for the long term." "The long term," I repeated. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I didn't rush. I tapped the screen and opened a high-resolution PDF. "It's funny you mentioned the paperwork, because when the trust office sent me the certified copies of the original 2018 filing, the ones you forgot were filed with a neutral third-party trustee in Delaware, the language looked a little different." The room went very still. The air felt thin, like the oxygen was being sucked out by a massive intake fan. "I don't know what you think you have," Mara said, her voice losing its melodic edge, turning sharp and metallic. "I have the original clauses," I said, walking toward her. I didn't stop until I was 5 feet away. I turned the phone screen toward the crowd, though I knew they couldn't see the fine print. The gesture was the point. Section 4, Paragraph 3. It's an irrevocable clause, Mara. It states that any attempt to alter the beneficiary structure without a unanimous vote from the Board of Trustees, which includes the bank and a neutral mediator, automatically freezes all distributions. It also triggers an immediate external audit of the person proposing the change. I saw the color drain from her face. It didn't go pale. It went a sallow, grayish hue, like old sheetrock. She looked at the portfolio in her hands as if it had suddenly turned into a live wire. "You're bluffing," she spat. "Hale signed these. They're notarized." "Notaries verify signatures, Mara. They don't verify the legality of the underlying theft," I said. I looked around the room, making eye contact with every aunt, uncle, and cousin who had been so quick to flip through her folders. "You all were so eager to see us gone. You thought there'd be more for you if the 3 of us were out of the way. But here's the reality. The moment she handed you those folders, she triggered the freeze. The trust is locked. Nobody gets a dime, not for the wetlands, not for the country club dues, and certainly not for any of you." A collective gasp went through the room. The predatory hunger I'd seen earlier turned into a sharp, jagged panic. "Evan, you've ruined the party," Aunt Sarah cried out, her voice high and shrill. "How could you do this to Leo? Tonight was supposed to be about family." "I didn't do this," I said, turning to her. "I just reported the leak. Mara's the one who cut the pipe." "You arrogant, selfish boy," Mara hissed, stepping away from the microphone. She was shaking now, her silk wrap slipping off one shoulder. "You think you're so smart? You just embarrassed your father in front of everyone he knows. You've made us a laughingstock. This isn't about money for you. It's about being right. It's about hurting us." "It's about balance," I said. You tried to erase us. You tried to tell my brothers and me that we didn't exist in our own family's history. You thought you could rewrite the manual while we weren't looking, but I was looking. My father finally looked at me. His eyes weren't angry, they were hollow. Evan, stop it. Just stop. We can talk about this later. There is no later, Hale, I said. I felt a surge of something cold and absolute. You stood there and let her hand out those folders. You watched her try to strip Marcus and Julian of everything our grandfather intended for them. You're not being protected. You're being used as a shield. The room was a mess of noise now. Relatives were arguing with each other. Leo, the groom-to-be, was sitting at the head table with his head in his hands. The coordinated strike had collapsed into a chaotic retreat. Mara stepped closer to me, her face inches from mine. She smelled like expensive perfume and desperation. You think you've won? She whispered, her voice a low, jagged rasp. You've just ensured that you'll never be invited to another house, another dinner, another holiday. You've made yourself an outcast. We'll tell everyone you're unstable. We'll tell them you forged those documents. Who are they going to believe? A technician who crawls in dirt, or us? I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to argue. I didn't feel the need to defend myself. I saw her for exactly what she was, a component that had outlived its usefulness, a part that needed to be replaced. They'll believe the bank, Mara, I said quietly. And the bank is already calling the trustee. By Monday morning, your access to the foundation accounts will be suspended pending the investigation. She lunged then, not a punch, but a frantic, clawing grab for my phone. I stepped back, a simple, fluid motion, and she stumbled, her heels catching on the carpet. She didn't fall, but she looked ridiculous, flailing for balance while the entire family watched. Get out, my father said, his voice finally finding some volume, though it was thin and reedy. Evan, Marcus, Julian, get out of here. You've done enough damage. I looked at my brothers. Marcus was vibrating with a mix of shock and adrenaline. Julian looked like he wanted to laugh. They both looked at me, waiting for the lead. We're going, I said. I looked back at the room, at the people who had been willing to watch us be discarded 5 minutes ago. But don't worry. This wasn't the scene. This was just the inspection. We walked out of the banquet hall. The cool night air hit me like a physical relief, clearing the lilac and gin from my lungs. As we reached the parking lot, Marcus grabbed my arm. That was incredible, Evan. You shut her down. You actually did it. The money's safe? The money's frozen, I corrected him, pulling my keys from my pocket. My hand was perfectly steady. And no, I didn't shut her down. I just signaled the start of the job. What do you mean? Julian asked, leaning against his car. You exposed her. Everyone saw. They didn't see enough, I said, looking back at the glowing windows of the hall. I could see the silhouettes of people inside, still gesturing wildly, still scrambling to save their own interests. They think this was about a trust fund. They think this was about a public embarrassment. They think it's over because the documents are on the table. I got into my van. The interior smelled of oil, metal, and hard work. It felt honest. I gripped the steering wheel, the leather cool under my palms. This wasn't the revenge, I said to the empty van. This was just the discovery of the fault. Now I start the repair. And when I'm done, there won't be anything left of her world but the scrap. I started the engine. The familiar rumble of the diesel motor was a comfort. I wasn't the difficult son anymore. I was the person who knew exactly how to dismantle a house without ever touching the foundation. Mara wanted to play with control and erasure. I was going to show her what it looked like when the world she had built simply stopped working. I put the van in gear and drove away, leaving the flickering lights of the party behind. My mind was already moving past the documents, past the trust, and into the mechanical heart of their lives. I wasn't going to reconcile. I wasn't going to forgive. I was going to collect everything they had taken, and I was going to do it with the same cold, methodical precision I used to fix a broken furnace in the middle of a blackout. The humiliation was over. The turn was beginning. The hum of a rooftop condenser unit is a lonely sound at 4 a.m. It's a rhythmic, mechanical thrum that vibrates through the soles of your boots, a reminder that while the rest of the city is tucked away in bed, the machinery of comfort never sleeps. I was kneeling on the gravel-covered roof of a medical supply warehouse, my headlamp cutting a white path through the swirling mist of a Jersey dawn. My hands moved with an automatic, practiced grace, checking the tension on a fan belt and testing the refrigerant levels. In the quiet, I wasn't just Evan Mercer, the HVAC tech. I was a man calculating the pressure required to make a structure collapse under its own weight. It had been 3 days since the engagement party. 3 days of silence from my father, 3 days of frantic, vitriolic text messages from Mara, which I had archived without reading, and 3 days of watching the family gossip mill churn through my social media feed. I was being painted as the aggressor, the unstable son who had attacked his aging father's happiness. It was a narrative Mara was spinning with the skill of a master weaver, and our relatives, desperate to stay on the side of the money, were buying every thread of it. I pulled a small, battered notebook from my pocket and made a notation on the unit's performance. But on the next page, I had a different set of notes. A map of Mara's world. Her nonprofit, Green Horizon Initiatives, relied entirely on the social standing of a few key board members and a revolving door of high-end donors who loved the optics of environmentalism but hated the reality of scandal. Then there was Hale's renovation business, mostly subcontracted out now, but still carrying his name and his reputation for old-school integrity. I stood up, wiping my hands on a rag. I looked out over the skyline, the orange sun just beginning to bleed through the gray haze. I felt a strange, detached calm. The anger that had simmered for years had been distilled into something much more useful: precision. The first step wasn't about the money, it was about the infrastructure. Later that morning, I pulled my van into the parking lot of a local strip mall. I wasn't there for a service call. I was there because I knew that Peter Thorne, an old family friend who had spent the last week posting about my tragic mental decline on Facebook, took his coffee at the same deli every day at 10. Peter was a mortgage broker who had helped Mara move certain assets around. He was the leak in the plumbing, the one who had fed her the confidence to think she could rewrite the trust without consequence. I saw him through the glass, sitting in a corner booth, looking over some papers. I didn't rush. I walked in, the bell above the door chiming with a cheerful, irritating ring. I bought a black coffee and walked straight to his table. I didn't ask to sit. I simply slid into the opposite bench. Peter looked up, his face instantly transitioning from boredom to a pinched, startled mask of fear. "Evan, what are you doing here?" "Checking the airflow, Peter," I said, my voice low and conversational. I didn't smile. I leaned forward, my elbows on the table, taking up as much of his personal space as the furniture allowed. "You've been very vocal lately, telling people I'm having a breakdown, telling people I made up the trust documents." I'm just saying what I heard, Evan. It's a tragedy, really. You should seek help." He tried to gather his papers, but I placed a heavy, grease-stained hand directly in the center of his stack. "Here's the thing about a breakdown, Peter," I said. "When a system breaks down, it's usually because someone ignored the warning signs. You helped Mara hide the secondary filings. You signed off on the valuation of the property transfers. That makes you part of the mechanical failure." "You're threatening me?" he stammered, looking around the deli. It was mostly empty, save for an old man reading a newspaper and the distracted teenager behind the counter. "I'm notifying you," I corrected. "I know about the kickbacks from the Green Horizon renovation contracts. I know how the numbers were padded to make it look like the trust was losing value while Mara's private accounts were gaining it. If you keep talking, I stop being a technician and I start being a whistleblower. And unlike Mara, I have the logs." I stood up, leaving my coffee untouched. I leaned in close, so close I could see the sweat beads forming on his upper lip. "Stay out of my family's business, Peter. If I hear your voice again or see your name on a screen, I won't just call the bank. I'll call the licensing board, and I'll do it with a smile." I walked out without looking back. It was a small strike, a minor adjustment to the pressure, but I could feel the shift. By noon, Peter had deleted every post. By 1, he had blocked Mara's number. The isolation was beginning. That afternoon, I met Marcus and Julian at a diner on the edge of town. They looked exhausted. Marcus had been passed over for a coaching promotion he was a lock for. The principal was a close friend of our father. Julian had been asked to take a leave from his firm until the family drama settled down. Mara was moving fast, using her social capital to choke the life out of my brothers' careers. "We can't win this, Evan," Marcus said, staring at his sandwich. "She's got everyone convinced we're the villains. Dad won't even pick up the phone. He thinks we've betrayed him." "He thinks that because he's being told a story," I said. I pulled out a set of blueprints for a renovation project my father was currently overseeing, a luxury townhouse complex in the city. But stories are fragile. They require everything to stay in its proper place. If you move one piece, the whole thing changes. "What are you planning?" Julian asked, his eyes narrowing. "Mara isn't the strategist here," I said, pointing at the signature line on the blueprints. The signature for the HVAC and plumbing permits wasn't my father's. It was a forgery. A good one, but the loops on the H were too tight. She's the face. She's the ego. But she's been exploiting a pattern. Dad hasn't been signing his own permits for 2 years. He's been letting her handle the boring stuff while he plays golf. She's been signing his name on everything: trust documents, permits, tax filings. That's fraud, Julian said. It's leverage, I countered. But I don't want a court case. A court case takes years. I want her to realize that the house she built is made of cardboard and I'm the one holding the match. Not a real match, Julian, a metaphorical one. I spent the next few hours explaining the next phase. It wasn't about a big, explosive confrontation. It was about a series of small, devastating malfunctions. That evening, I went to the renovation site. It was after hours, the crew gone, the skeleton of the building rising into the dark sky. I used my master key. Most contractors in this county use the same 5 locks for their site boxes. I didn't steal anything. I didn't break anything. I simply spent 2 hours in the basement, looking at the main gas line and the electrical manifold. I found exactly what I was looking for. Mara had hired a cut-rate plumbing subcontractor to maximize the administrative fees she was skimming. The work was shoddy. It was barely up to code. It was a ticking clock of a system, waiting for a reason to fail. As I worked, I thought about the king stories I used to read in the break room on long shifts. I thought about a good marriage, how a person can live next to someone for decades and never truly see the gears turning behind their eyes. My father had lived with Mara for 12 years. He thought he was living with a partner. He was actually living with a parasite that had slowly replaced his own nervous system with hers. He had been so willing to believe we were the problem because the alternative, that his wife was a predator, was too heavy to carry. I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt a cold, professional need to show him the truth. I adjusted a pressure valve on the main line, just enough to cause a persistent, annoying whistle in the pipes once the system was pressurized. Not dangerous, but loud enough to trigger an inspection that would reveal the forged signatures, an inspection that would trace back to the nonprofit's consulting fees. As I was leaving, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. You should have taken the deal at the party, Evan. Now there's nothing left for you. Even your brothers won't be able to help you when I'm done. I didn't reply. I just looked up at the dark windows of the townhouse. Mara thought she was playing a game of chess, moving pieces across a board. She didn't realize she was inside a machine, and I was the one with the wrench. The twist, the one I had been sensing since the party, finally clicked into place as I sat in my van. I looked at the signatures on my phone again. I looked at the dates. Mara had started the forgeries long before the trust disputes began. She hadn't been reacting to our disloyalty. She had been planning our erasure since the day she moved in, and the person who had given her the original templates, the person who had shown her how to mimic our father's hand, wasn't a lawyer or a consultant. It was someone who knew the family even better. I started the engine, the vibration of the van a steady, comforting presence. The isolation of Mara was step 1. The exposure of her fraud was step 2. But the third step, the one that would truly finish this, involved the person who had been sitting quietly in the background all along. I drove home through the dark streets, the silence of the night feeling like a heavy blanket. The plan was moving, the pressure was building, and tomorrow I would make sure the first pipe burst. The narrator's internal commentary remained dry and observational, even as the scale of the betrayal became clearer. There was no room for emotion in a well-tuned system. There was only the work, and the work was just beginning. The realization that a system has been sabotaged from within changes the way you look at every component. When I saw the specific slant of the ink on the second set of documents, the failed trust amendments that Mara had tried to push through a year ago, I didn't see her hand. I saw a ghost. The signature pattern wasn't just a mimicry of my father. It was an imitation of a style only the 3 of us brothers knew. It was the way we were taught to sign our chores list as kids. It was a family shorthand. I spent Tuesday morning on a rooftop overlooking the city, the wind whipping around the industrial exhaust fans. My phone was a constant weight in my pocket. The fallout from the party was finally reaching its peak. The trustee had officially frozen the accounts, and the Green Horizon nonprofit was suddenly under a microscope. I'd spent the previous evening sending anonymous, detailed tips to the compliance officers of the 3 major donors Mara relied on. I didn't make accusations. I simply sent them copies of the mismatched plumbing permits and the forged signature samples. In the world of high-end philanthropy, the mere scent of an audit is enough to make everyone vanish. By noon, the first structural failure occurred. My brother Marcus called, his voice tight but with a glimmer of hope. The principal called me in, Evan. He said he got an anonymous email regarding his conflict of interest with Hale's company. He sounded terrified. He told me to disregard our previous conversation about the promotion. He said my performance speaks for itself. What did you do? I just balanced the scales, Marcus, I said, watching a hawk circle the parking lot below. People only bully you when they think they have the high ground. I just showed him the ground is made of silt. But I couldn't enjoy the minor victory yet. The second document, The one that had failed was sitting on my passenger seat. It was a draft of a total asset transfer. If it had passed, every piece of property, every vehicle, and every cent of the family's holdings would have shifted not to Mara, but to a secondary holding company. And that holding company was registered to an address I recognized. It was the apartment Julian had lived in 5 years ago. I didn't call Julian. I drove. I found my father at his latest renovation site, the luxury townhouses. He was standing in the middle of a skeletal living room, surrounded by exposed studs and rolls of fiberglass insulation. He looked older than he had 3 days ago. The tan seemed to have faded into a sallow, parchment-like texture. He was staring at a manifold of PEX tubing that was whistling, the subtle malfunction I'd installed the night before. "It's not supposed to do that," he said without turning around. He knew my step. He knew the sound of my work boots. "It's a pressure imbalance, Hale," I said, walking to the center of the room. "The secondary regulator is fighting the main. It happens when you try to force too much through a line that wasn't designed for the load." He finally turned to look at me. "The bank called. Mara's been hysterical all morning. She says you're trying to destroy us. She says you're a thief." "I haven't taken anything," I said. "I'm just making sure no one else does either." I held out the folder containing the failed amendment. "I found this in the digital archives of the trust office. Mara tried to file it during your surgery last year, you remember? When you were too fogged out to know what day it was?" My father took the papers, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at the signature. "That's my name?" "It's your name, but it's Julian's handwriting style," I said. The air in the unfinished room felt heavy, smelling of sawdust and damp concrete. "She didn't do this alone, Hale. She had a partner, someone who knew the passcodes, someone who knew exactly how to make it look like a sibling rivalry so you'd be too distracted to see the actual theft." Hale sat down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket. The whistling from the pipes seemed to grow louder, a high-pitched, mocking note. "Julian wouldn't... He's my son." "He's your son who felt like he was being left behind," I said, the words feeling like grit in my mouth. "Mara promised him a larger cut if he helped her bypass me and Marcus. She played on his resentment the same way she played on your need for a quiet life. She's a master of finding the crack in the foundation and sticking a wedge in it." The confrontation I'd planned for Mara suddenly felt secondary. The betrayal from within the ranks of my own brothers was the real, mechanical failure. I'd been so focused on the external parasite that I'd missed the rot in the joists. Suddenly, the front door of the townhouse swung open. Mara marched in, her heels clicking sharply on the subfloor. She looked disheveled, her hair escaping its tight bun, her eyes wide and frantic. She saw me and stopped, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing. "You," she hissed. "The board just suspended me. My accounts are locked. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've ruined everything Hale worked for." "No," I said, stepping toward her. I didn't yell. I kept my voice in that calm technician's register, the one I use when I'm explaining to a homeowner that their house is about to flood. "I saved what was left. You and Julian were going to strip mine him. You were going to leave him with the liability and take the equity." "Julian has nothing to do with this," she shouted, but the pitch was too high. It was a panicked defense. I moved into her personal space. I'm a head taller than she is, and I spend my life hauling compressors up ladders. I don't have to be violent to be intimidating. I just have to exist in a space that someone else wants to occupy. I stepped forward, forcing her back toward a stack of drywall. "I saw the signature, Mara. I saw the holding company address," I said. "The game is over. The whistle you hear? That's the sound of the inspectors arriving. I called them an hour ago. I told them there were concerns about the structural integrity of the gas lines and the validity of the permits. They'll be here by 3. "You're lying," she said, though her eyes were darting toward the door. I reached out and placed my hand on the wall next to her head. I didn't touch her, I just leaned in, feeling the heat of her frantic breathing. "I don't lie about mechanics. Every permit you forged is about to be audited. Every dollar you skimmed from the nonprofit to pay off Julian's debts is going to be traced. You thought you were the smartest person in the room because you could manipulate a man who just wanted to be loved, but you forgot that the world is built on things that are real. Pipes, wires, documents, things that don't care about your feelings." Hale stood up from his bucket, his voice a low rumble. "Mara, is it true? Did you involve Julian?" She didn't answer him. She looked at me, her mouth working, but no sound coming out. In that moment, she wasn't the sophisticated philanthropist. She was a cornered animal, realizing the cage was made of her own lies. "I'm going to make sure you have nothing," I said, my voice a whisper now. "No reputation, no assets, no family. You're going to walk out of this building, and you're going to keep walking until you disappear. Because if you try to fight this, I will make sure the investigation looks into the administrative errors from your previous job, too. I've been busy, Mara. I've been looking at your entire history. I stepped back, releasing the tension. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. This was action scene number 2, not a brawl, but a systematic dismantling of her confidence. I watched as she realized she had no leverage left. She looked at my father, hoping for one last save, but Hale was looking at the whistle in the pipes, finally seeing the malfunction for what it was. Mara turned and fled. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't look back. She scrambled out the door, her heels slipping on the gravel outside. Hale looked at me, his eyes wet. Evan, I'm sorry. I didn't see. I know, I said. But seeing is only half the job. Now we have to clear the debris. But the victory felt hollow as I looked at the folder on the floor. Mara was gone, but Julian was still out there. My own brother had been willing to sell us out for a percentage of the wreckage. I felt the re-hook of the situation, the realization that the threat wasn't just my stepmother. It was a fractured family that had been brittle long before she arrived. I left my father in the unfinished room. I had work to do. I had a brother to find. As I walked to my van, I checked the time. The inspectors would be arriving soon, and the public collapse of Hale's renovation project would be the lead story in the local trade papers by morning. It would destroy the Trenwick name in the industry, but it would also clear the slate. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled up Julian's location on the family share app he'd forgotten to disable. He was at a bar downtown, probably waiting for a call from Mara that would never come. I put the van in gear. The sarcasm that usually protected me was gone, replaced by a grim, mechanical focus. I had spent my life fixing things that other people broke. Today, I was going to finish the job, even if it meant tearing down the last of the walls I'd grown up within. The air in the van felt charged, a static buildup before a storm. I wasn't just an HVAC tech anymore. I was the person who was going to ensure that by the time the sun went down, there would be no more secrets left in the vents. The logical twist had settled in. Mara wasn't the mastermind. She was just the tool Julian had used to try and leapfrog over me and Marcus. And now, I was going to show Julian exactly what happens when you try to overpressurize a system without knowing how to handle the blowback. The city blurred past as I drove toward the center of the collapse. I didn't feel unhinged. I felt calibrated. I felt like a machine that had finally been tuned to its peak performance. The devastation was only halfway complete. The bar was a low-ceilinged cavern called the Iron Rail, the kind of place where the air feels like it's been recycled since the mid-70s, and the lighting is designed to hide things rather than reveal them. I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. I didn't look like a man on a mission. I looked like a guy stopping for a drink after a long shift, my work shirt smudged with insulation dust and my tool belt removed, but the heavy loop still hanging from my hip. I spotted Julian in a corner booth, a half-empty pitcher of amber beer in front of him and a phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. He was staring at the screen, his thumb twitching in a rhythmic, anxious scroll. I didn't wait for him to look up. I walked over and slid into the booth across from him. The vinyl seat groaned under my weight. Julian flinched, his phone nearly slipping from his fingers. The cocky, Scotch-swilling brother from the engagement party was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd been living in a crawlspace for a week. "Evan," he croaked. He tried to summon a smirk, but it failed to reach his eyes. "Come to join the wreckage? I heard what happened at the townhouse. Mara called me screaming. She sounds unwell." "She's worse than unwell, Julian. She's irrelevant," I said. I leaned back, my arms spread across the top of the booth. "But you knew that was coming, didn't you? You were the one who gave her the keys to the house, literally and figuratively." Julian poured the rest of the beer into his glass, his hand shaking just enough to make the foam spill over the side. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just trying to mediate. Dad was losing his mind, and she was the only one keeping the business together." "Is that the story you're going with?" I asked. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, portable hard drive, setting it on the sticky table between us. Because I spent the last 4 hours at the office of that neutral trustee. Turns out, when you freeze an account due to suspected fraud, the digital trail becomes very easy to follow. I found the IP addresses used to access the trust's secure portal. 3 of them were from Mara's house, but 12 of them were from your apartment, Julian, mostly at 2 a.m. Julian's face didn't go pale, it went vacant. That was the tell. It was the look of a machine that had just been unplugged. "You were the one who showed her how to bypass the 2-factor authentication," I continued. "You were the one who told her which clauses were irrevocable and which ones we could bend. You weren't a victim of her manipulation. You were the architect of the bypass. You thought if you helped her push me and Marcus out, She'd make you the sole successor to the secondary holding company. You were selling our grandfather's legacy for a 30% commission. You don't understand how it was, Julian hissed, suddenly leaning forward, his voice a jagged whisper. You and Marcus were always the good ones, the reliable ones. I was the one Dad looked at when he needed a disappointment. Mara was the only one who actually listened to me. She made me feel like I was the smart one for once. She made you feel like a thief, Julian, I said. I felt a surge of cold, observational pity. It was like looking at a piece of equipment that had been installed backwards. No matter how much power you fed it, it was never going to work right. And now, she's gone. She's currently packing a suitcase while the state inspectors are tagging Dad's renovation site for a dozen code violations, all of which lead back to the contracts you helped her sign. What do you want, Evan? Julian asked, his voice breaking. You want me to apologize? You want me to go to the police? I want you to see the social collapse, I said. I pulled my phone out and turned it toward him. I sent the logs to the family group chat 10 minutes ago. Every aunt, every cousin, every person who was standing in that banquet hall watching us be humiliated. They all have the IP logs now. They have the timestamps. They know that while they were sipping Prosecco, you were busy trying to pick their pockets, too. The phone in Julian's hand began to buzz. Then it buzzed again and again. It was a cacophony of notifications, vibrations that sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. His eyes darted to the screen, seeing the names of the people who had been his allies 48 hours ago. You're a monster, he whispered. No, I'm an HVAC tech, I said. I find the blockage and I clear it. You were the blockage, Julian. You were the reason the air in this family has been toxic for a decade. I stood up. I didn't feel the need to stay for the fallout. I could see it already. Julian was staring at his phone, his social world evaporating in real time. He was being excluded, blocked, and erased by the very people he had tried to impress. It was a reputational devastation that no amount of money could fix. I walked out of the bar and into the cool evening air. The city felt different now, sharper, more defined. The isolation of Mara was complete, the exposure of Julian was in progress, but there was still one more piece of the system that needed to be addressed. I drove to my father's house, not the townhouse renovation, but the old Victorian where we had grown up, the one he still lived in with Mara. I knew she would be there, trying to salvage what she could before the legal freeze turned into a permanent lock. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the lights flickering inside. I walked to the side of the house, toward the external HVAC unit. I didn't need a key for this. I used a screwdriver to pop the service panel. I looked at the contactor, the heart of the system that controlled the climate of the entire house. It was a simple matter to bypass the thermostat, forcing the system into a high cycle loop that would make the house uncomfortably hot within the hour. It was a physical manifestation of the pressure they had put on us. I walked to the front door and pushed it open. It wasn't locked. Inside, the house was a mess of open drawers and half-packed boxes. Mara was in the hallway, clutching a jewelry box, her face a frantic smudge of smeared makeup and sweat. "Get out!" she screamed when she saw me. "The police! I'll call the police!" "On what phone, Mara?" I asked. "The one that's registered to the company account I just deactivated? Or maybe you'll use the landline that's currently being monitored by the bank's fraud department?" She backed away, her heels catching on a stray sweater on the floor. "Hale! Hale! Help me!" My father walked out of the study. He looked like a ghost inhabiting a suit. He didn't look at her. He looked at me. He was holding the folder I'd given him earlier, the one with Julian's handwriting. "I called the family meeting," Hale said, his voice flat and exhausted. "Everyone's coming here, tonight. They want answers, Evan. They want to know where the money went." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm here. We're going to have a final inspection." "You can't do this," Mara whimpered, collapsing onto a packing box. "You're destroying a man's life. Your own father." "I'm giving him his life back," I said. "It just doesn't have you in it." The re-hook of the moment hit me then. The realization that the final confrontation wouldn't be a private affair. It was going to be a public accounting, a gathering of the entire tribe to witness the collapse of the lies. I could feel the tension in the house building, the heat from the bypassed HVAC system starting to make the air thick and oppressive. It felt like the inside of a furnace just before the pilot light catches. I looked at my father. "Are you ready to see the rest of it, Hale? Because Julian is on his way, and he's not coming to apologize. He's coming to blame you for making him this way." Hale nodded slowly. He looked like a man preparing for a storm he knew he couldn't survive, but one he knew he had to face. I walked to the kitchen and sat at the table where we used to do our homework. I laid my hands flat on the wood. I could feel the vibration of the house, the mechanical hum of the system I had pushed to its limit. In an hour, This room would be filled with the people who had betrayed us, the people who had enabled Mara and the brother who had sold us out. There would be no reconciliation. There would be no forgiveness. There would only be the heat, the documents, and the slow, agonizing realization that the Trenwick name was a hollow shell. The psychological structure of the evening was inspired by the social collapse of needful things, the way exposure forces people to confront the ugliness they've been hiding behind politeness. As the first car pulled into the driveway, I felt a calm, unhinged sense of purpose. I wasn't just a technician anymore. I was the one who had finally turned the pressure up high enough to make the walls sweat. The final moment was approaching, the peak of the devastation, and as the doorbell rang, I stood up to answer it, ready to lead the final tour of the wreckage. The air inside the house was becoming a physical weight. I had bypassed the limiters on the furnace, and the vents were humming with a relentless dry heat that smelled of scorched dust and old memories. It was 82 degrees in the foyer and climbing. People began to trickle in, shedding their heavy coats and mopping their foreheads, looking confused by the tropical climate of a New Jersey Victorian in late autumn. This was the final setting, an enclosed box, pressurized and heated until the seams started to split. I stood at the top of the sunken living room, watching them assemble. Aunt Sarah, Uncle Barry, Leo, and a dozen other cousins who had spent the last week whispering about my instability. They sat on the floral sofas and the mahogany chairs Mara had picked out to replace the furniture my mother had loved. They looked uncomfortable, not just because of the temperature, but because the silence in the room was sharp. My father sat in his armchair, his hands folded over the folder of forgeries, looking like a man waiting for a verdict. Mara was hovering in the doorway of the kitchen, her eyes darting toward the front door. She was waiting for Julian. She thought he was her reinforcement. She didn't know I had already dismantled him in a booth at the iron rail. The front door slammed open, and Julian marched in. He didn't look like the strategist anymore. His tie was loosened, his hair was a mess, and he was clutching his phone as if it were a weapon that had backfired. He stopped when he saw the room full of family. He looked at me, and I saw the flicker of realization in his eyes. The realization that he hadn't been invited to a meeting, he'd been summoned to a funeral for his reputation. "What is this, Evan?" Julian shouted, his voice cracking. "A tribunal? You think you can just gather everyone here and play judge?" "I'm not the judge, Julian," I said, my voice calm, cutting through the rising heat. "I'm just the guy who turned on the lights. Why don't you take a seat? It's getting a little warm in here." "The air is stifling," Aunt Sarah complained, fanning herself with a cocktail napkin. "Hale, can't you do something about the thermostat?" "The thermostat is broken," I said, stepping down into the living room. "Just like the trust. Just like the renovation permits. Just like the stories you've all been telling yourselves about why Marcus and I were the problem." I walked to the center of the rug. I didn't use a microphone this time. The heat made everyone sluggish, their defenses lowered by physical discomfort. I pulled a stack of papers from my pocket, the final, undeniable links. "Mara," I said, turning to her. She flinched. "You told the family that the trust was being restructured for everyone's benefit. But these are the wire transfer logs from the foundation you set up, the one Julian helped you hide. $60,000 moved last month alone. Not to a charity, not to a wetland, to a shell company that paid off Julian's gambling markers and your private credit cards." A collective murmur rose from the sofas. Uncle Barry stood up, his face reddening. "Julian, is that true? You told me you were helping me with my bridge loan." "He wasn't helping you, Barry," I said. "He was using your loan as a cover to move the money out of Hale's reach. They were bleeding the system dry, and they were going to let the rest of you take the fall when the bank eventually noticed the shortfall." "You liar!" Mara screamed, stepping into the room. She looked at Hale. "Hale, don't listen to him. He's been obsessed with this since the party. He's forged these. He's trying to take everything for himself." My father stood up. He didn't look at Mara. He walked over to the coffee table and dropped the folder I'd given him earlier. It slid across the polished wood, stopping at Leo's feet. "Look at the signatures, Leo," my father said, his voice a low, hollow rumble. "Look at the way the H is looped. Look at the date. I was in the hospital that day. I was under anesthesia for a hip replacement. I didn't sign those. But someone did." Leo picked up the paper, his eyes widening. He looked at Julian. "This is your handwriting, Jules. This is the way you used to sign my permission slips in high school." The room erupted. It wasn't a coordinated argument. It was a chaotic collapse. Aunt Sarah began to cry. Uncle Barry was shouting at Julian. Mara was trying to grab the papers back, her nails scratching against the mahogany. I stood in the middle of it, the observer, the man who had calibrated the pressure to this exact moment. I walked over to the wall and slammed my hand against the vents. The metal rattled, a loud, jarring sound that cut through the shouting. "Listen to that," I yelled. "That's the sound of a system failing. You all sat there and watched while she tried to erase my children from this family. You all took her side because she had the checkbook. Well, the checkbook is empty. The accounts are frozen, and the inspectors are at the townhouse right now, pulling the licenses for every job Hale has on the books." "You destroyed my business?" Hale asked, looking at me with a mixture of horror and awe. "I ended the fraud, Hale," I said. "There is no business left. There's just a pile of forged permits and a massive tax liability that Mara and Julian created. You can save the house, and you can save your reputation if you cooperate with the trustee, but the rest of it is scrap metal." Julian lunged at me then. It wasn't a professional move. It was a desperate, flailing swing born of pure, unadulterated panic. I caught his wrist with one hand and shoved him back onto the sofa. I didn't hit him. I didn't have to. The physical disparity between a man who works with his hands and a man who works with a mouse was obvious. He tumbled back into the cushions, gasping for air in the thick, humid heat. "Stay down, Julian," I said. "You're done. You've been blocked from every account. I've already sent these logs to your firm's ethics committee. You won't be practicing law or finance or anything else involving other people's money for a very long time." Mara was backed into a corner, her face a mask of jagged, ugly defeat. She looked at the family members she had cultivated, the people she had manipulated with fake warmth and small favors. Every one of them was looking at her with a disgust that was as hot as the air in the room. "It's over, Mara," I said. "Pack what's yours, which isn't much. The jewelry, the clothes. The bank will probably let you keep those to avoid the hassle. But you're leaving this house tonight." "You can't kick me out," she shrieked. "I'm his wife." "And I'm the one who holds the power of attorney now," I said, pulling a final document from my pocket. "Hale signed it an hour ago. I'm the administrator of the estate until the audit is complete, and as the administrator, I'm telling you to go." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the furnace seemed to hold its breath. Mara looked at my father, her mouth open, waiting for the man she had controlled for 12 years to save her. Hale looked at her, and for the first time I saw the clarity in his eyes. He didn't look angry. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. "Evan's right," he said. "Go." Mara didn't scream again. She didn't fight. She turned and ran up the stairs, the sound of her frantic footsteps echoing through the house. Julian followed her, not to help, but to hide. I looked at the relatives left in the room. They were sweating, their faces pale, their eyes fixed on me. I was the one holding the wrench. I was the one who had dismantled their world. "You all should go too," I said. "The show is over. The air is going to stay hot for a while. I suggest you get used to the discomfort." They scrambled out, a frantic exodus of people who had realized they had bet on the wrong horse. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't apologize. They just wanted to be away from the heat and the truth. Finally, it was just me and my father in the living room. The house was vibrating with the force of the furnace. The smell of scorched air was overwhelming. "You really did it, Evan," Hale said, his voice a whisper. "You took it all down." "I didn't take it down, Hale," I said, walking toward the door. "I just showed you that it was already leaning. I'm an HVAC tech. I don't create the faults. I just find them." I walked out onto the porch. The night air was freezing, a sharp, violent contrast to the furnace room I'd left behind. I stood on the top step and took a deep breath, the cold filling my lungs like a physical relief. Behind me, I heard the front door click shut. I walked to my van. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I didn't feel a sense of loss. I felt the same way I do when I finish a difficult job on a Friday night, exhausted, steady, and ready to go home to my own family. The Trenwick name was ruined. The business was gone. My brother was a pariah. My stepmother was a fugitive. I put the van in gear and looked back at the house. The lights were flickering as the overpressurized system began to strain the electrical grid. A small, dry smile touched my lips. The devastation was complete. There was no epilogue. There were no reflections. There was only the cold night, the rumble of the diesel engine, and the road ahead. I drove away into the dark, the job finished, the system finally, mercifully, offline.